Welcome to the Orca. This was a pivotal weekend for the BC economy. Two huge stories broke, both of which will affect British Columbians for decades. And that's the pending approval by Royal Dutch Shell to commit $40 billion to the Canadian LNG project and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. So what does this mean for BC? Greg Davignon is the president and CEO of the Business Council of British Columbia and joins us now to break down both of these stories. Greg, hello.
Good morning, Rick.
So let's start with the USMCA. A little harder to say than NAFTA, but the details are still fairly scarce until this deal is ratified. From what you know, is this a good deal?
Well, we've had a cursory look at the deal, which has been posted on the U.S. trade site, which is required under U.S. law. And this is a good deal for Canada. There's simply, quite certainly, implications for the Canadian economy and segments of it, including British Columbia. But this gives us continued access to the largest economy in the world for Canadian goods and services, which are vital to the prosperity of the province of British Columbia.
On the surface, Chapter 19, the dispute resolution process, was something that Canada insisted upon. The Canadians wanted to get rid of that entirely. That's a win for Canada, but it comes at the cost as well of the Canadian dairy industry. Roughly 200,000 Canadian dairy farmers today are still pretty upset. So for every deal, there has to be a concession. Is that how we got Chapter 19?
Well, I think a lot of the media commentary has parsed off dairy versus Chapter 19, and I think that's a bit simplistic. This is the document that has 34 sections, 12 side letters. It encompasses an economy of $1.1 trillion in trade annually. And so the consequence of all of it is that you have to make concessions, as you pointed out, with respect to some of the things that are important to the overall agreement itself. One of the key things as a small trading economy is we need protections outside of the U.S. courts. We see it in the case of unilateral actions by the U.S. Trade Administration on tariffs and anti-dumping. And Canada's proven to be right more often than wrong when it's looked at through a tribunal that's covered under Section 18. So that's a critical component part of the agreement from our perspective. And frankly, we've had supply management and agriculture for some time. British Columbia is a part of that in poultry, eggs, and dairy. But the Business Council's perspective is we should be open trading economies, and change on supply management is well overdue.
We notice that the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum are still in place. Are those expected to be removed eventually?
Some of the commentary I've seen from the U.S. Trade Representative and others is that's an ongoing conversation outside of this agreement, but clearly it's material at the table, and I assume will be resolved at some point moving forward. A lot of the agreement has focused on auto parts and obviously the ability for automobile industry, both in Mexico and Canada, to continue to access the U.S. marketplace. And steel and aluminum are vital component parts of that. So I expect that will be.
How damaging might it have been for Canada had we not been able to come up with some sort of an agreement?
Well, we would have been into what some characterized as a zombie NAFTA. We're heading into the U.S. midterm elections. Nobody knew whether or not the Congress would approve any changes. Do we default back to the free trade agreement from the late 1980s? Or do we default back to WTO and global trade rules that would have seen on average about 3.5% duty on Canadian goods? So it would have been material in a lot of sectors. It would have completely disrupted supply chains throughout North America and globally. But most importantly, it would have limited one of the three things that we've had as an advantage in Canada over the last couple of decades. One is access to U.S. markets through the trade agreement. Second is a tax advantage. The third is a talent advantage. And we've lost the tax advantage here. And the uncertainty of not having a trade agreement would have been, I think, a real challenge for Canadian businesses trying to do business globally, where their first step usually is in the U.S. marketplace.
Well, as I said, this deal still has to be ratified, so we've all got our fingers crossed. Let's move on to the other big story of the weekend, and that is LNG. Do we expect to hear later this week from Royal Dutch Shell and its partners that they're willing to invest up to $40 billion in LNG development in British Columbia, in Canada generally. How big a deal is this for BC?
Well, in fact, it would be the largest capital investment by almost tenfold that we've seen in British Columbia in its entire history. But it's also material for Canada. We've become a place that has a reputation of not being able to place capital in energy, let alone in large greenfield projects in the last few decades. Too complicated, too costly, and too complex to get things done. So it starts to change some of that narrative. But when you drill into it deeper, Rick, what's really important here is how this got done. LNG Canada was given long-term regulatory stability. They were given tax changes and regulatory changes that made them more competitive, both at the federal and the provincial level. And they had First Nation support both in the pipeline and through the project itself. Those key components are material to every sector that's looking to invest and do business in British Columbia, whether you're in forestry, mining, agri-food, or any kind of infrastructure project, including ports. So for me, this is a clean start in that we can supply what is a world-class energy resource out of northeastern British Columbia to the world. We're going to see 35% increase in LNG demand in the next 2 decades alone for a world that's growing and looking for lower carbon inputs to replace coal and other circumstances. But the other reality is that we can do the same thing and become the low carbon supplier of choice globally and actually reduce global climate change if we provide the same kind of stability and economic competitive policies that the LNG sector has materialized in British Columbia.
Which are all great elements for future investment and development. Let's look at the grassroots of this, though. What does a $40 billion injection into the economy, particularly to the northern part of BC, mean?
Well, I think there's 2 things to look at. One is the project itself, but it also requires over $2 billion a year of ongoing investment in extracting natural gas and moving it to markets. And what people forget in British Columbia is that at its height in 2006, the revenue alone to the provincial treasury from natural gas extraction was the equivalent to pay for all of our post-secondary education budget and some of our K-12 budget alone. Now, that was when gas was at over $12 a cubic foot. But going forward, this is an opportunity to access that untapped resource, to create ongoing jobs for families in the Northeast, but also for every job that's created in the natural resource sector outside of Vancouver, there's another one created in Vancouver. So this is an urban and rural connection to our economies that are completely integrated in terms of the ability on professional services, banking, finance, engineering, and others that support that work in the Northeast and in the Northwest, on the project itself, but on an ongoing basis on extracting the energy for global markets.
Greg Devenio, thank you so much for your time today. We very much appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Rick. Appreciate it. Thank you.